the session itself, roadmap to the private sector.
So that's the session, and then I'll start off with probably Dr. Richard Munan here, just asking him as to what could be the role of private sector in achieving the SDGs or in achieving the NDCs of Kenya.
Yeah, thank you very much, Mr. Moderator, and to those who have already spoken. Let me first of all put things in perspective before I come to your question. And one of the biggest perspectives is that Kenya is a leader when it comes to climate change policy. Whether we like it or not, Kenya was actually the second country in the entire world that submitted the most ambitious climate change national determined contributions. That needs to be applauded. But when you look at Kenya, Kenya is losing over $2 billion each and every year as a result of changing climate. That's over 200 billion Kenyan shillings. And actually, as we're speaking today, some parts of Kenya are warming beyond 1.5 degrees. And we've heard there are droughts that are affecting over 2 million Kenyans. When you look at this, and look at the nationally determined contribution of Kenya to reduce emissions in the next 9 years by 32%, out of these, 87% of that reduction is dependent on external finance. And Kenya has committed only to contribute 13%. And now back to your question. The private sector, because Kenya is spending over $2.4 billion every year annually on climate change. And when you look at that, out of that amount, the private sector in Kenya is contributing over $900 million. So what we need to do to be able to ensure that the private sector actually takes charge is two words: investment perspectives. Investments to be able to build resilience and reduce emissions, but from the perspective of socio-economic and putting money in people's pockets as well as food on the table. And to do this, we need to start with one. The first point is to de-risk investments. The Central Bank of Kenya, we heard, actually have the guidance to investment risk, which means that it brought to the fore the significance of the importance of climate change. If you look at Kenya, agricultural sector, that contributes 33% to the GDP of the country. It contributes over 75% to industrial application and over 80% to incomes to the community. It then means the private sector cannot be able to survive when the value chain, especially in the agro value chain, is not intervened to be climate-proofed. They will be out of business. That's a fact under the changing climate. And therefore, leveraging on solutions to climate-proof, like simple nature-based solutions that mothers in communities are actually leveraging, called ecosystem-based adaptation, that have proven to increase yields by 500% using simple techniques, agroforestry, conservation agriculture, or leveraging on simple clean technologies like solar dryers to reduce post-harvest loss, costing Kenya today $500 million each and every year. These are actions to be taken. The second part is to be able to leverage on low-risk partnerships. And I listened to the panelists before, very brilliant ideas. You cannot be able to drive transformational development and empower the vulnerable in communities without leveraging on local infrastructure, local structures that those communities depend on. We need to tap into local governance structures, local communal structures like cooperatives, like chamas, so that at least we tap and channel investments through those structures that are closer to the community level. That way, you will be turbocharging and supercharging the bottom that can then be resilient to the changing climate. I will stop there for now.
Fantastic. Go ahead, please. You can clap. That's precisely what I was saying. He will charge the panel discussion today. So thank you so much, Richard, for that. You spoke very comprehensively. You spoke about finance. You spoke about structures. You spoke about low-hanging fruits. I think we heard too many ideas there. It will take some time for me to conceptualize all those ideas and mention back to the panelists. So that leads to the second question, Dr. Richard. You've been working with UN for quite some time, and you've been championing the agenda of climate change. And UN has many organizations, like Stephen has mentioned this morning. Now, how can the private sector reach out to UN, or how can UN help the private sector to unlock this, to implement this 10-point agenda, for example?
Yeah, thank you very much. I think Dr. Mungai have already alluded to some of the aspects that need to be done. Firstly, let me put this again in perspective. The multiplier of climate change is emissions. The higher the emissions, the higher the temperature, and the more the communities will become more vulnerable. That way, if you look at that way, before I come to your question, the UNEP emissions gap report, which was released last week, showed that below what we are supposed to do in the next 10 years, because the world is supposed to reduce emission by 55%, but all the commitments submitted by the entire world is only 7.5% between now and 2030. When you look at the 10-point charter, the first one to me is really what I call the creme de la creme for the private sector, because it talks about reducing emission by 5% between now and 2030. That then means if you multiply that by nine years, you're talking 45% reduction, which is higher than the 32% that the country, Kenya, have submitted as their commitment to cut emissions. That is beyond fantastic. What does that then mean? It then means the organizations, for example, like UNEP, can then be able to guide willing private sector actors on how they can translate their actions into investment plans that are climate-proofed. And what we are building on is bringing science, bringing tools that we have tested on the ground to work. For example, Kenya is a negligible emitter, only about 0.1%. But what I indicated from the data we have, Kenya, some parts of Kenya are warming above 1.5. That then means that for Kenya to then be able to transition, it needs what is called a just transition, equity and justice. And Dr. Mungai alluded to this. It then means we need three aspects. We must move away from projecting climate change as a liability to projecting it as an investment opportunity. How do we do that? By focusing on actions that can actually empower people from the bottom up. Through our work, what we have been doing have been engaging young people. And what we noticed was that if you ignore young people, because you cannot be able to reach out, even if you are the biggest private sector, without tapping into people's ingenuity and potential. The young people are vibrant, they're innovative, they're passionate, and most of them are on their own, without resources, developing technologies and solutions that can be able to solve problems. 2 hours from Nairobi here, you reach Mua. What we noticed there working with young people was that in Mua, where rice is being grown, one farmer during harvest, and when there is a downpour of rain, they lose about 50 kilograms of rice. But when we engage young people, we actually started helping them to retool their skills to start developing simple climate action solutions of solar dryers. And what we noticed was that when farmers started using those solar dryers, they were able to cut the time they dry by 48 times. And then they did not only reduce the losses, but they increased their incomes by 30% and reduced post-harvest losses, and this created jobs for the youth. So the point I am making is, leveraging on these already practical examples, the private sector can tap into this to not only drive that at scale, but also leverage that as a business, but build in empowering young people, in solving community problems. And I go back to what I started with. Without putting money in more people's pockets, without ensuring that there is food on the table, the sustainability of any business is not possible.
Fantastic. Thank you so much. And I like the confident way in which you are reading out all the statistics. It must be right. You're able to see the numbers here somewhere in the virtuals. Fantastic. So Richard, to you first. There are two questions which I wanted to pose from the members. One was on the drivers for consumption. How do we ensure that we do capacity building for both demand side as well as supply side? Because there is demand, supply wouldn't understand the demand. There is supply, demand wouldn't understand there would be supply. So that's one question. And the second question is our friend here, where he's talking about the structures and various other things. So if you can answer those two questions, the remaining questions I think I'll direct to Edward.
Yeah, thank you very much, Mr. Moderator, and thanks to all those who have asked questions. I think, Mr. Moderator, maybe I will loop in the question on the solar dryer which was about why do we do it if there is no market. I think I will loop that in with the one on demand, sustainability, consumption. This is the point, and I think I'll be very frank on this. Africa is sometimes described as a bedrock of challenges, as a continent of adversity. But what we have missed for quite a very long time is that we do not see challenges as disguised opportunities. In Kenya, for example, 83.6% of the employment is created by the informal sector. 70% of outlets where many of us get our products are from small kiosks. There is even what is called Kidogo economy. What is my point? This informal sector have challenges. The mothers in Moya that I mentioned that are losing their rights because they do not have opportunities or innovative instruments to dry them, that's a gap. We do not look at a gap. We start to complain upfront before we seize the opportunity. That is a disabler. It therefore means if you identify the gap, that's already a market. Markets are people. Markets are common peoples, common citizens, ordinary citizens. And when you devise a solution that closes a gap, you will tap into that market. Let me just give a very practical example, which sometimes is emotional. 700,000 Africans die every year because of indoor pollution, because they depend on charcoal. When you bring it down to Kenya here, between 14,000 to 20,000 Kenyans die every year because of indoor pollution. Why? Because they depend on charcoal. They've committed no crime. The only crime is that they find, look, they don't have an alternative to cook food. If you are able to just learn a skill to turn waste to briquettes, to replace those charcoal, which we are seeing in the work we are doing, simple briquettes that are non-smoky, that burns longer, are actually cheaper than charcoal, and this will help close a gap. That's a market that is worth 20 billion US dollars across the continent and 1.6 billion US dollars in Kenya. So to say that why do you have to develop a solution when there is no market for it means you haven't done your homework. And that is not right. Now to the demand, I think I've touched that, because if you develop a product without actually having understood the market gap, then definitely that product is going to get lost and you will not be able to actually solve a problem. And then a third point still on that is that we must not always start because we have the tools. It is through experimentation and sometimes through struggle that we find the best innovations that then will attract people who can be able to uptake it. I am saying this because most of the youth, what we've seen through an approach that we call innovative volunteerism, have nothing but what they just wanted was to be inspired that you can be able to do it. They went online and learned skills. And today, these youth have created climatepreneurship enterprises across the continent. That is debunking the myth that without money, we cannot do anything. And I think to the last point on that is an aspect that I think we've not touched about it since morning till now. And I think Dr. Mungai alluded to it in a way. Regardless of the enabling policy in place, regardless of the amount of money in place, if you threw it on passionless people, nothing will happen. It is passion that brings ideas to real-life solutions. And so we need to start seeing how we also inspire people to identify what they have and do something not just because it's going to bring them money, but because they are to solve a problem. And what you need to understand, anytime you solve a problem, you make money. Thank you.
You need to have passion, and with passion comes ability to solve the problem. And if you solve the problem, you have money. Just as a parting shot, what message would you like to give, Richard, for this entire event, and what should be in store come next year?
Yeah, thanks again, Mr. Moderator, and thanks to those who have asked questions, and to Dr. Mungai here. I think I will go back to what I said. This African proverb summarizes it so nice. If you close your eyes to facts, you will learn through accidents. The facts are very clear. There are challenges, but those challenges are disguised opportunities. But what the private sector needs to do, they should leverage the informal sector as their entry market. You cannot ignore your base and expect that you can survive in anything you do. They are your market. The second parting point is that Africa's youth, and especially Kenya's youth, are the powerhouse of the country and of the continent. Without engaging them to retool their skills, to actually develop passion and interest to become climate action solution providers, we might not be able to implement the NDCs even if we have all the money. It's people that do development. The last part is we cannot ignore the local structures, on which I'll go back to touch a little bit on the question that my friend who is sitting here asks. When you look across the entire African community and Kenya here, there are local structures, whether they are chamas or whether they are cooperatives. Let's build through them and use them as conduits of climate action, because that ensures two things: accountability and traceability. If the private sector can engage through those, we will be helping to build from the bottom up, and at the same time also have institutions that we can strengthen that becomes the champions. And lastly, to build on what Dr. Mungai said, without putting all these aspects within the vision of national development, which is making entrepreneurship to become the norm and not the exception, integrating this into school curriculum, we might not be able to go that far. And on top of that, developing de-risking tool. Kenya collects, I think, about 1 trillion Kenyan shillings in taxes. How can those resources be used to develop de-risking tools that can then be able to leverage on local institutions, whether they are local cooperatives, so that at least resources, especially to those who are doing work that is tied to climate action solutions, can actually be channeled through those institutions, so that there can be traceability and accountability, and that is how we can tap opportunities and turbocharge the bottom to the top. Thank you.